On the sweltering afternoon of July 22nd, 2019, Marissa Langford, a 38-year-old long-haul driver from Spokane, Washington, guided her 18-wheeler onto Highway 15, just north of a rural town near the California state line. Her trailer was loaded with emergency medical equipment destined for a distribution center near Santierra, a route she'd traveled more times than she could count in her 14-year career behind the wheel. What began as a typical midsummer haul would soon spiral into one of the most intense survival ordeals in recent trucking history, an event that not only pushed a professional driver to her limits, but also revealed the deadly consequences of climate-fueled wildfire behavior and delayed emergency response. The summer of 2019 had been merciless across the western U.S. Drought-stricken forests. Record-setting temperatures and dry lightning had sparked over a dozen blazes in the region. While national headlines zeroed in on fires threatening major cities, fewer eyes were on the Ash Hollow fire, which had been smoldering for days in the remote highlands west of Highway 15. Initially considered a low priority, contained in rough terrain far from population centers, the fire was assigned minimal resources. But on the morning of July 22nd, a sudden shift in the wind turned the slow-moving burn into a fast-moving inferno. Within hours, the Ash Hollow fire ballooned from 9,000 acres to over 26,000, and it was now heading straight for the highway, faster than authorities could warn those already traveling its path. Langford was among nearly 70 vehicles, including 8 other semis, that were about to find themselves trapped in a 22-mile stretch of asphalt soon to be consumed by fire. Her first warning came in the form of a strange distortion in the sky, a dull gray haze blanketing the vivid blue horizon behind the silhouette of the Sierra Pine Ridge. It was subtle at first, but enough to prompt her to radio another driver nearby. "Something's off with that smoke," she said over the CB. The reply crackled through the speaker. "Yeah, wind's changed. If it's rolling east, we've got a problem." They didn't know yet how right they were. By 1:20 p.m., smoke was thickening rapidly, and Langford's dashcam later recovered showed how the view went from open, sunlit forest to a suffocating gray murk in less than 15 minutes. Burning debris floated down like ash from a volcano. Winds had surged past 45 miles per hour. At 1:43 p.m., her dashcam caught the moment she eased off the gas. A sea of brake lights lit up ahead. Traffic was at a standstill. Through her windshield, barely visible through the smoke, a lone state trooper waved frantically, shouting through a megaphone. "The fire jumped the ridge," a voice shouted over the CB. "It's coming straight down the hill." Langford's voice, steady and calm, cut through the rising panic. "Keep it together, folks. We're on pavement. Both sides clear. If we stay inside our trucks, we should be okay." Logical advice, based on standard wildfire protocol. But the fire that was approaching wasn't standard. By 2 p.m., the leading edge of the fire reached the embankment just west of the highway. Fueled by dry timber and turbocharged by wind gusts over 60 miles per hour, it formed what wildfire specialists call a flame tsunami, a horizontal wall of fire taller than trees and faster than a person could ever run. Langford's dashcam trembled as the inferno hit. The sky turned black. Visibility dropped to inches. Trees erupted in sheets of fire on both sides. The temperature inside her cab, according to her environmental sensors, spiked from 94 degrees Fahrenheit to over 125 degrees Fahrenheit in under 5 minutes. What followed was nearly 50 minutes of sustained hell. Survivors later described it as being trapped inside an oven with no way out. Langford, whose training included hazardous materials safety, went into crisis mode. Her cab audio documented her calm, measured response. She radioed clear instructions over the CB. "Turn off all engines, save oxygen and power. Close all vents. Wet any cloth you can find and seal your windows. Cover your face. Breathe through the cloth." She took stock of her own supplies, a half case of water bottles, an emergency air mask from her hazmat kit, and thick cab insulation that offered partial defense against the rising heat. She soaked towels and stuffed them into the door cracks. The cabin became a makeshift bunker. Out the side window, she saw a family in a van panicking, children pressed against the glass, adults yelling into phones. Langford grabbed a cardboard sign, scribbled a message in thick black marker, and held it up against her window. "Stay in vehicle. Cover faces. Wet clothes. But what came next was the real horror. At 2:25 p.m., a flaming pine tree, its trunk weakened by heat, toppled onto the road less than 40 feet ahead. It smashed into a small sedan, crushing the roof with a sickening crunch. Without hesitating, Langford grabbed her emergency kit and left the relative safety of her cab. Her external camera captured the moment she disappeared into the smoke. She found the driver's side flattened. Circling to the passenger door, she struggled to wrench it open, once, twice, before finally succeeding. Inside was an unconscious man in his 60s, later identified as Henry Mason, a retired electrician. Blood streamed from a gash on his forehead. Langford dragged him across the center console and out onto the asphalt, coughing, stumbling through the heat haze as embers swirled around her like glowing insects. Twice she fell. Her arms, neck, and cheeks turned red from heat exposure. She pulled Mason into her cab, sealed the door, and resumed radioing for help. Civilian male down. Head wound. Breathing. Fire knocked tree down on his vehicle. Mile marker 765. Need medevac now. The reply came, not from emergency services, but another driver ahead. Road's gone north of you. Whole stretch is on fire. No way in or out. For the next half hour, Langford kept Mason alive, pouring water over his arms, checking his breathing, and staying on the radio, giving updates every 10 minutes. The temperature inside her cab reached 138 degrees Fahrenheit. She continued to pour water on her arms and over his forehead to stave off heat stroke. Finally, at 3:12 p.m., the worst of the fire had moved on. Visibility returned enough to make out the destruction left behind. Twisted metal, scorched trees, glowing coals lining the shoulder. From the haze, flashing lights appeared, fire engines and rescue trucks crawling toward them from the south. The fire front had passed. Langford's final transmission caught on her cab mic. "They're here. Hang in there, sir. Help's almost here." In the days that followed, the Ash Hollow fire incident, as it came to be known, made national news. Of the nearly 70 vehicles trapped, 62 people survived, most suffering from heat exhaustion and smoke inhalation. 3 lives were lost: an elderly couple who attempted to flee on foot, and the driver of a convertible who couldn't shield himself from the flames. Henry Mason spent over 2 weeks in critical care. Doctors said he'd have died within minutes, if not for Langford's intervention. "I saw the tree come down," he told reporters later. "Then I woke up in the hospital. They said I had maybe 5 minutes left. That woman saved my life." Langford herself was hospitalized for weeks. Second-degree burns along her arms, neck, and face required skin grafts. Nightmares followed. The scent of smoke would leave her gasping. Panic attacks would come with every strong wind. But she turned trauma into action. In the months that followed, she collaborated with the National Trucking Federation to develop wildfire-specific safety protocols for truckers. She donated her dashcam footage to the National Wildfire Response Alliance, where it became required viewing for both truckers and first responders. The Ash Hollow incident revealed massive gaps in emergency response coordination. Investigators determined that the fire's rapid advance could have been predicted hours in advance, but poor communication between forestry and transportation departments delayed highway closure orders. California eventually overhauled its alert systems, integrating real-time fire modeling with transportation networks. Today, similar systems are in place across 7 western states. The trucking industry also changed. Many carriers now equip trucks with emergency fire kits, including thermal blankets, N95 masks, and burn gel. 9 months after the incident, Langford returned to the road. When asked why she came back, her answer was simple. "The road's part of who I am. But now I carry more than just freight. I carry the memory of what we survived." Today, at a rest stop near mile marker 765, a memorial plaque stands in the scorched remains of a former overlook. It bears the names of the 3 who perished, and a quote attributed to Marissa Langford. "In your darkest moment, you are not alone." For those who still drive Highway 15 through the Western Corridor, the memory of Ash Hollow lingers, shared in whispered stories between truckers, passed down like road wisdom. And chief among those lessons is Langford's message that day. Stay inside. Protect your air. Help if you can. The true horror of Ash Hollow doesn't lie in the death toll. but in what's coming. Wildfires are growing faster, more unpredictable, more deadly, and for the men and women who haul America's lifeblood across the highways, every summer brings a new question. Will the roads still be there tomorrow, or will the fire get there first? Before we proceed, please let us know where you're from. Also, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel and be a part of our small community. Let's continue. Nathan Riker had spent nearly a decade transporting some of the most dangerous substances across the country. At 41, the veteran driver had handled everything from toxic industrial solvents to infectious medical waste. Known among his peers at Continental Hazard Logistics as meticulous and unshakable, Nathan had built a spotless reputation. No violations, no mishandlings, no close calls. He was the company's go-to operator for volatile or high-security jobs. That reputation is what placed him behind the wheel on October 8, 2017, for a transport that would challenge every rule he'd ever followed and uncover a chilling truth about how hazardous materials really move through America. The night air was sharper than expected as Nathan arrived at a remote facility outside Maddox, Montana, a fenced, unnamed complex marked only by a Department of Energy code stenciled near the loading bay. It was one of many private contractors operating in the shadows, developing chemical agents for confidential federal applications. Security was intense. Nathan surrendered his phone and was escorted inside by armed personnel. In the control room, a stoic shipping coordinator slid a tablet across the desk. "This one's a level 4 containment," he said, without looking up. "Destination's the NBX response site outside Greystone. You'll be on Route 490. Highway Patrol's been notified. No active construction." Nathan paused. Level 4, the highest non-nuclear security classification. In nearly 10 years, he'd handled only 2 shipments at that level, both involving military-grade nerve agents, both escorted by armed convoys. "I don't see any escort listed," he said, scrolling through the digital manifest. The coordinator shrugged. "Budget's tight. They're monitoring you by satellite. You've got the secure uplink, yeah?" Nathan nodded. Installed directly in his rig's cab, the secure comm unit allowed uninterrupted communication with dispatch and federal monitors. Standard for Level 4. But what wasn't standard was the cargo's size. A single reinforced containment cylinder, just under 4 feet tall, bolted to a specialized pallet. Most high-tier shipments filled entire trailers. "What am I carrying?" Nathan asked, already suspecting he wouldn't get a real answer. "Classified," the man said, tapping the tablet. "All you need to know is this: if containment breaches, get at least 5 miles upwind. Use the emergency containment kit in your cab if, and only if, there's no other choice. It's a last-ditch barrier, like a body bag. But for that, Nathan had transported enough dangerous materials to read between the lines. A 5-mile evacuation radius meant airborne, lethal, possibly irreversible. At 10:15 p.m., the containment cylinder was secured inside his custom-modified trailer. With the manifest signed and protocols reviewed, he pulled onto Route 490, a long, winding stretch that cut through the remote mountain corridors of north-central Montana. Under ideal conditions, it was a 6-hour trip. The forecast called for light snow after midnight. Nothing he couldn't handle. At 11:41 p.m., he checked in via the encrypted comms link. Transport 114. Checkpoint Alpha reached. All systems normal. Payload secure. Current position mile marker 38. ETA to next checkpoint, 55 minutes. The reply was nearly instantaneous. Acknowledged. Satellite confirms position. Be advised, storm cell developing ahead. Accumulation may reach 4 inches by 0200 hours. Nathan wasn't worried. His vehicle was built for traction and stability. But what no one anticipated was a critical malfunction deep inside the electrical system. Specifically, the alternator powering both the engine and the cooling system tied to the cargo. At 12:19 a.m., warning lights lit up the dash like a Christmas tree. The primary power system was failing. Within seconds, the backup engaged, but not cleanly. Flickering lights, static-riddled comms. The truck's cabin buzzed with alarm chimes. Nathan grabbed the radio. Transport 114. Power system failure. Primary is down. Backup active, but showing signs of instability. Requesting immediate technical support. Possible escort. The response crackled through the speakers. Transport 114. Satellite confirms anomalies. Closest response unit is 90 minutes out. Patrol rerouted, ETA 44 minutes. Your priority is cargo. Initiate stationary protocol if required. Stationary protocol meant pulling over, locking down the trailer, and waiting for help. But before he could act, the secondary system died. Entirely. The engine cut. The cabin fell silent. The headlights went out. Now moving only by inertia, Nathan guided the powerless rig onto the shoulder, using emergency battery-fed steering and brakes. The trailer's environmental systems, critical to keeping volatile content stabilized, would run on backup batteries for only 30 minutes. Then, the real danger would begin. A sharp, unfamiliar sound drew his attention. At first faint, then unmistakable. Hissing, coming from the trailer. Every hazmat driver knows. Unexpected noises from the containment unit mean you're already in the red zone. Nathan grabbed his flashlight, exited the cab, and moved cautiously toward the rear. The hissing grew louder, an urgent, pulsing release of pressure. He didn't dare open the trailer. Instead, he activated the external monitor panel, a standalone diagnostic device powered by an independent cell. The readings chilled him to the core. Internal temperature, 58 degrees Fahrenheit, and climbing. The material was only stable between 34 degrees Fahrenheit and 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Worse still, the atmospheric sensors registered trace amounts of an unknown compound inside the trailer air. The seal was breaking. Containment was failing. He had about 20 minutes before the internal batteries gave out and the trailer's cooling system died completely. The cylinder inside wouldn't survive long after that. Nathan had three options. Attempt a blind electrical repair, deploy the emergency containment bag, or execute intentional isolation, the most extreme protocol in hazmat transport. Intentional isolation meant taking the cargo as far from human exposure as possible, abandoning the truck, and hoping no one ever came close. It was considered last resort, theoretical. He'd only ever read about it. With no time left, Nathan decided he'd first attempt containment. If that failed, isolation would follow. He retrieved the emergency kit from behind the seat, a specialized containment sleeve, essentially a chemically reinforced encasement bag, and a limited protection hazmat suit. Suddenly, the secure uplink buzzed to life on its backup cell. Transport 114. We're detecting thermal anomalies. Patrol ETA now 38 minutes. Hazmat unit dispatched from Greystone. ETA 3 hours. Please confirm status. His response was grim. Confirm containment breach. Attempting emergency procedures. Cooling failure imminent. Request airspace restriction and 5-mile evacuation radius. The reply was instant. Understood. Satellite uplink will remain active. We've lost sensor telemetry. You're now our only eyes on site. Suiting up, Nathan reviewed the wind charts in his head. The breeze was from the northwest. That meant any airborne release would head southeast, directly towards Stone Hill, a town of 1,300 people, just 30 miles away. The margin for error was zero. Oxygen flowing, suit sealed, he opened the trailer. The hiss screamed in his ears. The cylinder stood upright in the center of the rig, frost forming along a jagged crack in its shell. A faint vapor leaked into the air, swirling in the beam of his flashlight. Working fast, he unfolded the bag, lifted the cylinder, nearly 90 pounds, and encased it, sealing it with industrial clamps built into the lining. 7 minutes passed. 7 minutes inhaling whatever unknown substance was escaping, even through filtered air. His onboard sensors detected nothing. But some of these materials were so advanced, they couldn't even be picked up by standard hazmat gear. With the container sealed, he closed the trailer and retreated to the cab. Oxygen, 21 minutes remaining. He followed the final stage of protocol, intentional isolation. No engine, no power. Just a steep slope nearby, and what remained of his truck's battery-assisted steering. He coasted off the main road and down a forest access trail, coming to rest in a rocky clearing nearly half a mile from the highway. No homes, no structures. Engaging every manual lock, security measure, and warning beacon, he left the truck behind. He walked 3 miles in silence through snowy darkness. At 1:14 a.m., a highway patrol cruiser picked him up, flashlight catching on his frosted visor. The hazmat team arrived 2.5 hours later. By then, the trailer's temperature had risen past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, but the containment bag had held. Investigators would later confirm the cargo was a classified neurochemical agent, an experimental substance with the potential for high-volume aerosol dispersion in combat zones. Nathan Riker spent 72 hours under intensive medical observation. He displayed no symptoms. Still, he would undergo monthly screenings for 5 years. The fallout was immediate. Congress launched an inquiry into unescorted transport of classified materials. New legislation mandated armed escort for all Level 4 loads, regardless of cost. Nathan never drove hazmat again. The trauma of those 7 minutes in the trailer, breathing unknown vapors in the dead of night, haunted him. Today, he trains new recruits, preparing them for scenarios they hope they'll never face. His story is now mandatory reading in hazmat certification programs. For the men and women who move America's most dangerous materials, through mountain passes and forgotten highways, the story of Transport 114 is more than just a case study. It's a warning. Some things we carry are too dangerous to ignore, and too terrifying to forget. Gordon Wells never thought of himself as a hero. At 46, the seasoned truck driver from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had spent more than 2 decades navigating freight routes across the upper Midwest. He'd faced snow squalls in Nebraska, black ice in Wisconsin, and even once outran a tornado in central Kansas. Weather to him was just part of the job, something to be respected, endured, and worked around. But nothing in his 23 years behind the wheel had prepared him for the storm that rolled in on January 14, 2018. A day that would test not only his survival instincts, but also the limits of his empathy. The winter of 2017 to 2018 had been unusually mild across the Great Plains. That changed in mid-January, when a massive Arctic cold front surged down from Canada, colliding with moisture-heavy air streaming in from the Gulf. Meteorologists had flagged the system as potentially disruptive, forecasting measurable snowfall and plummeting temperatures. What they didn't predict was just how violent the storm would become once it swept into the Dakotas. Wells had departed from Rochester, Minnesota, that morning, hauling farming equipment en route to a distribution center near Bayfield. It was a route he knew well, routine and uneventful, or so he assumed. The forecast warned of 8 to 10 inches of snow and single-digit wind chills. Difficult, but nothing he hadn't powered through before. By 2:20 p.m., as he crossed into North Dakota on Interstate 92, conditions began to sour rapidly. The snow, which had started gently, now came in fierce horizontal streaks. Wind gusts whipped across the plains, carving ground blizzards along the highway. Visibility dropped. Fast. Wells' dash cam, footage that would later be used in official investigations, caught his murmured warning to himself. This wind's going sideways. Might need to pull off soon. Then, at 3:09 p.m., his CB crackled with a critical update. All eastbound lanes on I-92 closing immediately from the Minnesota line to Bayfield due to deteriorating road conditions. Drivers are instructed to exit as soon as safely possible. The nearest exit with lodging and services was Langdon, roughly 13 miles ahead. He estimated he could reach it in 15 to 20 minutes, driving cautiously. What Wells couldn't know was that he had just entered a rare meteorological event, an intense, fast-forming mesoscale snow band. These hyperlocalized storm systems can dump over 3 inches of snow per hour and produce near-hurricane-strength winds. At 3:18 p.m., everything changed. The world outside vanished into pure white. No horizon, no road, just a featureless void of swirling snow. His speed dropped under 20 miles per hour. He relied on the rumble strips to stay centered and scanned anxiously for the reflective signage indicating the Langdon off-ramp. Then red lights, brief and distant. He eased onto the brakes, keeping his rig stable. But the brake lights blinked out suddenly, then reappeared, much closer, and turned sideways. A sedan had spun out and now blocked part of the right lane and shoulder. Wells skillfully maneuvered left, narrowly missing it. His side mirror captured a haunting glimpse. Michigan plates, a nearly buried vehicle, hazard lights faint in the storm. He reached for the radio to report it, but something stopped him. A child's face, in the back window, pale, frightened, illuminated for just a heartbeat by his headlights. Protocol dictated that drivers not stop. In whiteout conditions, roadside assistance could lead to more accidents, possibly fatal ones. He should have reported the car's position and moved on to safety. But Gordon Wells didn't. Instead, he slowed his rig to a crawl, stopping about 250 feet ahead. He angled his trailer across the lane, shielding the sedan from the wind. Hazard lights flashing, he threw on his coat and grabbed his emergency gear. Wind gusts later clocked at 60 miles per hour tore at him as he trudged back through knee-deep snowdrifts. He reached the car and knocked on the driver's window. Inside were Hannah Riley, 33, and her two children, Ella, 6, and Brady, 3, on their way to Jamestown when they'd lost control nearly an hour earlier. The engine was sputtering. The heater was failing. Snow was rising fast along the sides of the vehicle. Riley had called 911, but with dozens of pileups across the region, help had been vague, hours away, if that. Her youngest was already lethargic and disoriented, classic signs of early hypothermia. I knew they wouldn't make it waiting in that car, Wells later told investigators. That little boy was going under. They needed to get warm now. He carried Brady himself, shielding the toddler's face from the wind, while Riley held Ella's hand. The walk, just 250 feet, took nearly 15 minutes in the brutal whiteout. Inside the cab, Wells cranked the heat, wrapped them in emergency blankets, and passed out bottled water and granola bars from his survival stash. But the storm wasn't finished. By 4 p.m., the system intensified further. Wind gusts reached 68 miles per hour, qualifying as hurricane strength. Snow fell so fast that parked vehicles vanished under drifts in under an hour. Wells tried contacting dispatch and highway patrol again. Radio static. No signal. Only once, around 4:45 p.m., did he manage to reach patrol briefly. He gave his GPS coordinates and reported his 3 passengers. Then silence. All emergency teams were already occupied. There was no estimate on when they might arrive. As dusk fell, the realization sank in. They were trapped. Though his truck was fully fueled, idling only bought them 20 hours of heat. Temperatures outside plummeted to minus 14 degrees Fahrenheit before the local weather station was disabled by ice buildup. Wells' dashcam continued to document everything. 6:11 p.m., he rationed food. Checked the exhaust pipe repeatedly to prevent snow from blocking it. A deadly oversight that can cause carbon monoxide to flood a cab. 9 p.m., Brady, once listless, was laughing at silly knock-knock jokes Wells was making up on the spot. Throughout the night, he ran the engine in intervals, 30 minutes on, 15 off, preserving fuel while keeping the cab just warm enough to survive. By dawn, January 15th, the blizzard had eased, but their problems hadn't. Snow had buried the cab halfway up the windows. Inside, everyone wore double layers, huddled under emergency blankets. At 7:50 a.m., Wells caught a momentary cell signal, just enough to text his exact location to emergency services. The reply was grim. Response delayed. Roads still blocked. No ETA. With fuel dwindling and interior temps dipping during engine-off periods, Wells made a bold decision. He and Hannah used plastic sheeting and snow shovels to pack snow tightly along the truck's exterior, insulating it like an igloo. It worked. Temps inside stabilized. That move, emergency officials later stated, likely saved their lives. Finally, at 2:14 p.m., they heard it, the rumble of plows. A Department of Transportation crew, accompanied by paramedics and state patrol, reached them at 2:36 p.m. All 4 occupants of the cab were alive, in remarkably stable condition. Despite 23 hours of exposure to one of the worst blizzards in state history, they had survived. Elsewhere, 17 people were not so fortunate. Most had died in vehicles with failed heaters, insufficient supplies, or blocked exhausts. The Riley family was categorized as a statistical anomaly, survivors of conditions that were, on paper, unsurvivable. Initially, Wells' employer issued him a formal warning for breaching protocol. The public response was swift and furious. Within a week, the reprimand was rescinded, and the company launched the Wells Winter Safety Program, supplying enhanced emergency kits and autonomy guidelines for all drivers. Wells himself became a vocal advocate for driver discretion in emergencies and flexible response training in disaster conditions. He spoke at safety seminars, pushing for common sense over blind procedure. The North Dakota legislature passed what would come to be known as the Wells Act, protecting commercial drivers from liability when rendering emergency assistance during declared weather disasters. Today, inside the North Dakota Highway Patrol headquarters in Bayfield, there's a modest plaque mounted near the operations desk. It reads, "When the rules say keep going, but your gut says stop, listen to your gut, because sometimes survival depends on it." Gene Wells. Truckers who travel I-92 in the winter months still share the story, sometimes over coffee and truck stops, sometimes over CB in whiteout conditions. It's a tale not just of survival, but of conscience, because sometimes the greatest act of heroism is simply refusing to drive away. Logan Price had driven Colorado's Falcon Ridge Pass more times than he could count. At 48, the veteran hauler from Des Moines, Iowa, had spent over a decade weaving his 18-wheeler through its unforgiving switchbacks, hairpin turns, and narrow ledges, transporting equipment from the western oil fields to distribution hubs outside Aurora. Every incline, curve, and rockfall-prone zone was etched into his memory. But on the morning of June 11, 2019, that knowledge would be pushed to its limits. What began as another calculated early morning run would turn into a brush with death and expose a criminal tactic that had gone unnoticed for years. He left the Summit Quarry Depot just after 5 a.m., hauling heavy industrial gear eastbound. It was a smart time to travel, before the tourist caravans clogged the pass, and while the light mountain air still held its early summer chill. Forecasts called for calm weather, no precipitation, and mild temperatures in the 60s. By 7:20 a.m., Logan reached the lower incline of Falcon Ridge Pass. As he eased into the climb, he spotted something unusual ahead, a white pickup parked at a scenic overlook, hazard lights blinking. Two men stood nearby, wearing what appeared to be Colorado DOT uniforms. They were placing cones around a short section of bent guardrail. It didn't trigger alarm. Summer maintenance crews were a common sight. Still, out of caution, Logan slowed and gave them a wide berth. One of the men nodded, but something about the scene sat wrong in Logan's gut. He couldn't explain it yet, just a whisper of discomfort. 10 minutes later, as he carefully navigated the notorious curve known as Dead Man's Elbow, it clicked. No official markings. The pickup had lacked the standard state fleet decals and vehicle ID tags required on all authorized DOT trucks. It was a small inconsistency, one most wouldn't notice, but Logan had dealt with real highway crews for years. He developed a sixth sense for what felt legit. He reached for the CB to call in the anomaly, but stopped short. His dashboard lit up. Engine warning. Sudden power loss. His truck began to sputter. What moments earlier had been mild unease now spiked to full-blown alarm. Fighting the incline, Logan maneuvered into a gravel pull-out used for emergency stops. He set the brake, popped the hood, and stepped out. And that's when the bottom dropped out of his morning. His fuel line had been cut, then crudely reattached with a pressure clamp, enough to keep it functional for a few miles before failing completely. It wasn't just a malfunction. It was sabotage. Had it given out even 2 minutes later, he would have been descending Bearjaw Ledge, where there's no shoulder, only a steep plunge nearly 1,400 feet down. Luckily, his dash cam had been running since departure, a habit he'd picked up after a near collision with a reckless RV 3 years earlier. He rewound the feed. There they were, the two maintenance men, faces half covered by ball caps and sunglasses. But the camera caught the license plate on the pickup. Logan reached for his phone. No service. Not uncommon out there. But he wasn't without options. He activated his satellite communication terminal, built into the truck's cabin for remote logistics support. He pinged his dispatcher with an SOS, GPS coordinates, and a detailed rundown of the suspicious vehicle and possible sabotage. The reply was nearly instant. No DOT work scheduled in that area. State Patrol alerted. Stay in vehicle. Do not engage. He had barely acknowledged the message when a silver sedan rolled past, slowing noticeably as it passed his truck. The driver, dark sunglasses, low cap, seemed to stare a moment too long before the car disappeared around the bend. Logan's instincts screamed. 5 minutes later, the sedan returned, this time from the opposite direction. It pulled into the same overlook, roughly 60 feet away. 2 men stepped out. Same build, same clothing, same posture. No vests. No cones. No pretense. Logan locked his doors and pulled out his phone again, this time recording through his side mirror. One of the men, tall and lean, approached with an easy grin and something dark tucked discreetly in his hand, a tire iron. "Hey there, need a hand?" the man called out casually. "Looks like you're in a bind." Logan didn't reply. Instead, he leaned forward and slammed his palm on the external air horn. The blaring sound echoed across the canyon walls, sending birds scattering from the trees. The men flinched, startled. Another blast followed. They exchanged a glance. The act was over. The second man moved to flank the trailer, circling wide. The taller one raised his voice, this time sharp and stripped of charm. "We know what you're hauling. Open up the cab now. Cooperate and no one gets hurt." They wanted the cargo. What they didn't know was that Logan had undergone security training during a brief stint in private military contracting 2 decades earlier. He understood defensive positioning, and he knew the cabin gave him an upper hand. He also knew backup wouldn't arrive for at least 20 to 30 minutes. He decided to hold the line. Each minute, he blasted the horn. Intermittent. Harsh. Enough to keep the men jumpy, and maybe alert another driver coming up the pass. Then, the taller man pulled a handgun from his waistband. He shouted, "Last chance. Get out, or we come in." Logan didn't hesitate. He had 1 card left. Modern semis operate with complex pneumatic systems. By activating a specific sequence of controls, he could trigger a full air purge beneath the rig, a release designed to dump pressure from the brakes during emergency lockouts. But at close range, it could also function as a deterrent. As the armed man neared the driver's side door, Logan engaged the purge. A deafening hiss exploded from beneath the chassis, kicking dust and debris into the air. The sound was jarring. The pressure wave disoriented the man, who stumbled backward, nearly losing his grip on the gun, which clattered to the asphalt. And then, fate showed up. A Colorado Highway Patrol cruiser rounded the curve and entered the overlook, on its way to an unrelated incident higher up the pass. The trooper hadn't yet received the dispatch alert about Logan's emergency, but the scene was unmistakable. 2 civilians advancing on a disabled rig, one scrambling to retrieve something off the ground. The officer lit up his lights. "Hands visible. Step away from the vehicle," he shouted through the PA system. The 2 men bolted for their sedan. They didn't make it far. The cruiser boxed them in just as another patrol vehicle arrived from the westbound lane. The ambush was over. The investigation that followed peeled back a chilling conspiracy. The men, identified as Evan and Kyle Maris, brothers from western Utah, were linked to 8 other incidents across Colorado, Wyoming, and Nevada where commercial rigs had experienced sudden mechanical failures in remote terrain. In 2 cases, the drivers had never been found. Authorities discovered stolen IDs, shipping manifests, and detailed highway maps with strategic pullouts marked, locations with limited cell service and long law enforcement response times. Logan's near miss exposed a 3-year criminal operation targeting high-value shipments of industrial tools, electronics, and rare metals. The stolen cargo was funneled through black market distribution rings overseas. The trucking world reacted swiftly. Companies updated security policies. Satellite alert systems were upgraded. Escorts became more common on certain remote routes. Routine roadside checks were phased out, replaced by mandatory service stops at secure checkpoints. And dash cams? Now a standard feature on most long-haul fleets. Logan Price received awards from the State Highway Safety Commission and the Commercial Vehicle Association for his composure and decisive action. He still drives the passes, but now teaches security awareness seminars to other truckers. When asked about that day on Falcon Ridge, he always answers the same way. The roads have always had dangers: snow, rock slides, brake failure. But those you can prepare for. It's the threats that wear a smile and a uniform you really have to watch out for. At the same scenic overlook where the ambush was foiled, an unofficial marker now stands. A small iron medallion bolted into the rock by fellow drivers. Beneath it, etched in steel, "Stay sharp. Stay alive." For those hauling freight through America's most isolated routes, Logan's story serves as a chilling reminder. Out here, sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the road. It's what waits beside it. In the pitch-black hours before dawn during a brutal Midwest winter, veteran truck driver Mark Ellison guided his 18-wheeler into a desolate truck stop just off a stretch of interstate somewhere between the plains and the mountains. After nearly 14 hours of non-stop driving, the emptiness of the open road had settled into his bones like a second skin. But he had a deadline to meet. His delivery in a Colorado city needed to arrive by noon the next day. The weather forecast had grown grim, with warnings of an incoming snowstorm, one that could rival the worst in decades. Mark had pushed harder than usual, hoping to stay one step ahead of it. Now the truck stop stood eerily still, an unusually quiet scene for a Thursday night. Only 2 other rigs sat in the wide parking lot, both dark and lifeless as if abandoned. Mark rubbed his eyes, dry and burning from fatigue, and decided to grab a hot drink before catching a few hours of sleep in his cab. As he stepped down from his truck, the wind lashed at his face, sharp and merciless, carrying the kind of cold that made your bones ache. The tall parking lot lights buzzed above, their flickering bulbs casting strange, stretched shadows that swayed across the asphalt. Inside, the cafe was deserted, save for the hum of aging fluorescent lights and the faint clatter of cups behind the counter. A woman stood there, middle-aged, with tired eyes and a blank expression. Her name tag read Marla. She poured Mark a cup of coffee without asking. "You're the third one tonight," she said flatly, voice low. All looked the same, worn out and in a rush. The other 2 didn't stick around. They drove off, couldn't be bothered to wait out the storm. Mark nodded, grateful for the warmth of the cup in his hands. "Storm that bad?" Marla gave a slow, tired shrug. "Weather Service says it's one of the worst in 30 years. State patrols shutting down the interstate westbound in about an hour. You stay, you're stuck here till morning." She slid a menu across the counter. "Kitchen's closing in 10. Might as well eat." Mark ordered something quick, distracted by the rising wind outside. He could hear it whistling even through the thick walls. The weight of his looming deadline gnawed at him, but experience told him not to challenge a Midwestern blizzard. The lights above them flickered again, and Marla looked up uneasily. "Been doing that all night," she muttered. "Generator's on its last legs. Owner keeps saying he'll replace it." Then she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping just above a whisper. "Look, I don't usually say this to customers, but if I were you, I'd find somewhere else to sleep tonight." Mark paused mid-bite. "Why's that?" Marla's gaze shifted around the empty cafe, though no one else was there. "This place, it's got a history, especially in the dead of winter." She hesitated, then continued. "Back in '98, a trucker got snowed in, same as tonight. They found his rig running the next morning, but he was gone. 2 weeks later, what was left of him turned up in a field 5 miles away. Official report blamed the cold, said he got turned around in the storm. But," Mark pressed, suddenly less hungry. "But," Marla said, straightening and wiping down the counter with a rag, "he wasn't the first. And he wasn't the last." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather crept into Mark's spine. He finished his meal quickly, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. Marla's story lingered in his thoughts, but he chalked it up to local legend. Still, he felt eyes on him as he stepped back into the storm. Outside, the snow had picked up, swirling madly in the orange glow of the parking lot lights. The wind howled like it had a voice, wailing between the buildings with an almost human cadence. Mark climbed into his cab, turned up the heater, and tried to settle in. But sleep didn't come. The truck rocked in the gusts, and tiny shards of ice rattled against the windows like fingernails tapping for entry. At around 2 a.m., Mark bolted upright, startled by the sound of his CB radio crackling to life. Static filled the cab. Then a voice, barely audible, fragmented, emerged through the noise. "Mile marker, 142. Help, they're not letting me leave." Mark froze. Mile marker 142 was exactly where he was parked. He grabbed the mic. "This is Mark Ellison at the I-90 stop, mile 142. Who's calling for help?" Over. Nothing but static answered. Then the voice came again, clearer now, and more desperate. They come when you sleep, they're hungry, always hungry. The chill inside him deepened. He glanced through the frosted windshield. The two other rigs were still dark, seemingly empty. Something didn't sit right. If another driver was in danger, he had to check it out. Mark yanked on his coat and stepped out into a nightmare. The blizzard had become a full whiteout. His flashlight beam barely cut through the flurry, and the wind clawed at him with frozen fingers. He called out into the storm, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. Then, in the dim cone of his flashlight, something moved. A figure bent, slow, and shuffling, passed between the parked rigs. Mark called again, louder. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it simply faded into the snow, vanishing like mist. He reached the cafe, now dark and locked tight. Through the iced-over glass, he could just make out the faint glow of a single emergency light inside. Tables were overturned. No sign of Marla. He pounded on the door, but no one came. Turning back, Mark's breath caught in his throat. The two other trucks were gone. In their place, 3 distinct sets of footprints led from where the rigs had been, straight to his truck. None led away. His pulse thundered as he stumbled back toward his vehicle. The snow had already started erasing his tracks. Around him, the wind carried whispers, not voices, not exactly. More like thoughts brushing the edge of consciousness. His truck came into view, dark and looming, and the driver's door was open, swinging. He knew he had locked it. Mark's hand moved instinctively to the small utility knife in his coat pocket. Hardly a defense, but it made him feel slightly less helpless. He climbed up cautiously, scanning the cab with his flashlight. Empty. He slammed the door shut and locked it, hands trembling. He tried the ignition. Nothing. Battery was dead. He reached for his phone. No signal. His CB radio? Silent. Completely lifeless. Every form of communication had failed. And then came the sound, soft at first. A thump. On the roof. Followed by slow, dragging footsteps moving across the metal above him. Mark didn't move. He barely breathed. The knife felt useless in his grip. The footsteps stopped, then scratching long, deliberate, like claws teasing the thin roof above. He looked up, and the metal began to bend inward. Slowly. Something was pressing down. Something heavy. The windshield cracked, fractures spidering out from the center. The cold slipped in with the snow, along with a familiar whisper. No longer wind, but a voice he could understand. We've been waiting, Mark. So many miles, always alone. But you're not alone anymore. The windshield shattered, and with the wind came shapes, gaunt, skeletal things with flesh the color of ice, eyes glowing like glass in the dark, and jaws too wide, too full of teeth. Their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles. 3 days later, once the storm cleared and roads reopened, a patrolman found Mark's truck. It was empty. The windshield had caved in, the interior filled with snow. No sign of a struggle. No blood. Mark Ellison's body was discovered nearly 2 weeks later in a barren field 5 miles away. Cause of death was ruled exposure and disorientation from the storm. Nothing unusual, officially. The officer who found the truck didn't write down the claw-like gashes on the roof. He also didn't mention the CB radio had been locked to a frequency that hadn't been in service since 1998. And the coroner? He quietly resigned weeks later, claiming he needed a fresh start. Rumors say he'd never seen eyes like that before, pure white, frozen wide in terror. These days, truckers steer clear of that rest stop, especially in the winter. They say if you tune your CB to the old emergency frequency during a snowstorm, you might still hear Mark's voice cutting through the static. They come when you sleep. They're hungry. Always hungry. On the night of May 18th, 2012, long-haul trucker Daniel Mercer set off from a logistics hub near Montgomery, heading west with a trailer full of commercial cleaning agents bound for a distribution center outside Phoenix. At 44 years old, Daniel was a seasoned professional. He'd been driving cross-country routes for nearly 16 years with Iron Ridge Freight, earning a reputation for dependability, safety, and strict adherence to check-in procedures. Everything about the trip started off as expected. Mercer radioed dispatch after entering Mississippi, mentioning clear skies and minimal traffic. He stayed on schedule, making another routine call from just past Little Rock, where he noted he'd be pulling over for his overnight break at a familiar stop, the Silver Plains Truck Depot, just east of Oklahoma City. He had slept there on previous hauls, never reporting anything out of the ordinary. But the following morning, Daniel missed his check-in. At first, his dispatcher, Karen Brooks, wasn't alarmed. Signal loss in rural Oklahoma was nothing new, and truckers sometimes delayed their check-ins by an hour or two. But by noon, concerns began to mount. Mercer's GPS still pinned him to the truck stop, over 12 hours after his arrival and 4 hours past his expected departure. He wasn't responding to calls on either his cell or his CB. Following company protocol, Karen called the depot. The manager on duty, Rick Hanley, agreed to walk the lot. What he reported back would mark the start of a mystery that remains unresolved. His rig's here, parked right where he said he'd be. Engine's cold. Cab doors locked, Hanley told her. But his logbook and phone are still inside. Wallet, too. It's like he stepped out for a minute and just never came back. The local police were called. Officer Craig Donnelly was the first on the scene. He confirmed that the truck was indeed locked, and Daniel's personal items, wallet, prescription medication, phone, and his neatly organized logbook, had been left behind. The last entry in that book, scribbled at 9:43 p.m., simply read, "Arrived Silver Plains. Something feels off." Security footage from the truck stop added another layer of concern. It showed Daniel's truck pulling in at 9:39 p.m., matching the time in his log. For minutes later, he stepped out of the cab and stood for a while next to his rig, scanning the nearly empty parking lot. He then started walking toward the main building. But halfway there, he stopped abruptly. On camera, he appeared to turn sharply to his left, staring at a poorly lit section of the lot, just outside the camera's range. For almost half a minute, he stood motionless. Then, with what looked like sudden resolve, he turned and walked directly into the shadows. He never reappeared on any camera again. As concern escalated, the Oklahoma State Police took over. Detective Laura Finch led the investigation and ordered an immediate grid search of the surrounding area. Cadaver dogs scoured the truck stop and nearby woods, but found no trace. Mercer's medication, still in his cab, made it clear he hadn't planned to be gone long. His bank account remained untouched. His cell phone, last active during an 8:15 p.m. call to his wife, hadn't pinged a single tower since. Then came the witness reports. Other truckers who had spent that night at Silver Plains began sharing what they'd seen or felt. Kenneth Doyle, who had parked 2 spots down from Daniel, mentioned seeing flickering lights in the tree line behind the depot around 9:30 p.m. Not headlights, not flashlights, he told detectives. It was more like these bluish-white pulses, almost electrical, but there was no truck back there. Gave me a weird feeling. I shut my curtains and locked my doors. Angelica Ruiz, another driver on the opposite end of the lot, recalled hearing a strange sound around 10 p.m., about 15 minutes after Daniel was last seen. It was like something tearing metal. I thought a truck was being stripped or something. I looked out, saw nothing. Then all the dogs in the area started howling at the same time. That was the part that made my skin crawl. I've been on the road for over a decade, and I've never heard anything like that. But the most chilling testimony came from Peter Malloy, a driver who had been parked right beside Daniel's truck. He told Finch, "I was half asleep when I heard movement. Thought someone was trying to break in. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the side window. There was a man standing between the trucks, just standing there, facing Daniel's cab, completely still. I hit him with the flashlight beam, and he turned toward me." Peter hesitated, visibly shaken. After prompting, he continued. His face was wrong, too smooth, no expression, like a wax figure that just came out of the rain. And his eyes, they reflected the light like a cat's. I dropped my flashlight. When I picked it up, he was gone. Investigators pursued every lead. There was no record of Daniel being admitted to any hospitals or shelters. No signs of foul play. No motive for a voluntary disappearance. He had a clean record, no debts, and strong ties to his family. By every account, Daniel Mercer had no reason to run. Then, 5 days later, something strange came to light. Detective Finch discovered that at 9:41 p.m., just minutes before Daniel's final log entry, He had placed a brief call to a fellow trucker, Reggie Collier, an old friend. Reggie, when reached at a delivery point in St. Louis, confirmed the call. He sounded weird, spooked. He asked if I remembered the old stories, stuff our uncles and grandfathers used to talk about. Road phantoms, hitchhikers that never blink. All that highway folklore. Reggie said he laughed it off. Then Dan got quiet and said, "I think I'm looking at one, Reggie. I think they're real." The line went dead. Reggie tried calling back. It went straight to voicemail. When police asked Daniel's wife, Lena, about these stories, she admitted they were part of the family's history. Daniel's grandfather had been a trucker in the 50s and 60s and would often talk about ghostly figures along remote highways, beings that preyed on loners in the night. Dan never bought into it, Lena insisted. He used to joke that Grandpa was just trying to scare him into quitting the job. Weeks passed, then months. Search teams combed a 5-mile radius. Nothing. Daniel's DNA and dental records were submitted to national databases for unidentified remains. Still nothing. Finally, 8 months after he vanished, the case was deemed inactive, though not officially closed. Then, on the first anniversary of his disappearance, a maintenance worker clearing brush behind the depot stumbled upon something wedged in the fork of a tree, 15 feet off the ground. It was Daniel's cap, a red meshback trucker's hat bearing the Iron Ridge Freight logo, still vibrant, almost untouched by the weather. On the inside band, forensic analysis later revealed deep grooves, made by human fingernails, dragged into the fabric like someone had clung to it, been pulled away, and tried to hold on. No other trace of Daniel Mercer has ever been found. His truck, eventually returned to the company, was later sold to a small regional carrier. But several drivers refused to use it, claiming electrical glitches and unexplained cold spots, especially in the bunk. A few even reported whispers on the CB, tuned to dead channels. The Silver Plains Truck Depot has since been renovated and renamed, but for drivers who know the legend, it still carries weight. Many refuse to stop there overnight. Those who do often leave their headlights on, just in case. As for Detective Finch, who retired not long after the case went cold, her final report included a handwritten note. "In all my years, I've never seen a man disappear so completely. People don't just vanish, unless something takes them."